Private equity is absolutely everywhere. They own so many businesses, it's almost unbelievable. If you put on your new pair of Skechers to go for a run on the treadmill at your local Pure Gym, and then pick up some Fox's biscuits and Flora spread from the Morrisons on your way home, then you'll have given money to 5 different private equity companies. And you might have heard people talk about how private equity is bad for the businesses that they own, and the economy as a whole, as it enriches the elite few at the expense of everyone else. But what the hell even is private equity? What exactly did these finance bros who earn 500k a year actually do all day? And is it really that bad for businesses and our economy? And when I first started to think about this question, I realised I knew very little about private equity. I'd only ever heard broad statements about how terrible it is. So I decided to do some digging, and I spent a lot of time down the private equity rabbit hole to find out exactly what this industry was all about, and whether it's as bad as some people are saying. And what I found was pretty interesting. So, to explain, we need to begin by defining exactly what private equity is, and what companies like Blackstone, KKR and Apollo actually do all day. Now, private equity is a very broad term. Equity in this context is just referring to an ownership stake in a business. So for example, if you own 20% of ABC Limited, then we'll say that you own 20% of the equity of that company. And private just means that the company is not publicly listed, i.e. it's not listed on a stock exchange anywhere, so the average person can't just go and buy shares in it. So anyone that owns shares in a business which is not publicly listed on a stock exchange will own private equity, or equity that is private. But when most people say private equity, or the private equity industry, what they're really referring to are private equity companies like Blackstone or Apollo Global Management, who specialise in finding privately owned companies, acquiring ownership stakes in them, growing them aggressively over a period of 3 to 5 years, to then sell their ownership stakes in the future for a profit. You can think of it a bit like flipping a house, i.e. an investor will come in and try and buy the house as cheaply as possible, maybe invest some money in extensions or renovations, and then sell the house later for a profit. But instead of just an individual house, private equity companies will come and do this to an entire business. So the first question I had was, what's so bad about this? Surely this is just the same as any other investment, and isn't it needed to allow companies to grow and realise their full potential? And what I found was, in a lot of cases, the answer is yes. There's a lot of private equity success stories out there where the business in question was able to grow drastically thanks to their private equity backing, creating jobs and making tons of money for both the business owners and the private equity investors. But unfortunately, after a bit more digging, I found that not all private equity stories are nice and rosy. And in fact, there's a lot of shady shit that goes on that you wouldn't even believe is legal, especially when you start to look at the huge American PE firms like Blackstone or KKR. So let's take a look at some of these stories, starting with the good before moving on to the bad and the downright ugly. Now, contrary to popular opinion, not all private equity companies are evil, extractive conglomerates that secretly own the world. Some are just small companies who take money from investors such as pension funds and find promising businesses to invest in and hopefully grow, benefiting both the business itself, the investors, and the economy as a whole. Take the example of Loungers, the UK-based hospitality chain that own brands such as Cozy Club and the Lounge chain of restaurants. These guys were founded back in 2003, when 3 friends opened a cafe bar in Bristol, and have since grown to be a hugely successful chain with over 250 sites and employing over 8,000 people. And it's safe to say that their amazing growth on this scale would not have been possible without the backing of their private equity investors. And let's just think for a minute the benefits that this has for the UK economy. Loungers provides employment for over 8,000 people and pays out over £140 million in salaries each year. They also paid over £3.5 million in corporation tax last year and over £9 million in national insurance taxes, so contributing heavily to the public purse. And all of this was helped along the way massively by their private equity investors. So, to say that all private equity is bad is really misleading, as it can help to create a lot of value for the economy and society as a whole. However, as I hinted earlier, not all private equity stories are as fun and positive as that of Loungers. And as I started to scratch beneath the surface, I started to discover the darker side of private equity. Now, one of the ways in which private equity can put pressure on and really squeeze a business is the way in which their takeovers are structured. Private equity firms specialise in borrowing a huge heap of money from the bank to purchase businesses, then attaching that debt onto the business itself rather than to themselves. So it's the business that they've acquired that owes the debt to the bank, rather than the private equity company themselves. This is known as a leveraged buyout, or LBO, and it might sound pretty innocent on the surface, but if we start to dig a bit deeper, we can see how it might become problematic. For example, let's say you're the CEO of a business who manufactures specialist parts for aeroplanes and satellites, and you've recently been taken over by private equity, who's purchased your business through an LBO. Now, all of a sudden, because of this leveraged buyout, your company now owes a massive amount of money to the bank, and is now obliged to make huge interest payments on a monthly basis. So instead of reinvesting the business's profits into research and development of new products like you used to do, You've instead got to use this money to make these huge interest payments on a monthly basis. And there's no longer any room to increase your staff's wages or give out bonuses for good performance, as all of the business's spare cash is going into paying down this loan. At the same time, you're also getting huge amounts of pressure from your new private equity owners to aggressively increase your profits as quickly as possible, as they want to sell this business for a profit in a few years' time. So you as the CEO are left with no choice but to overwork your machinery and your employees to increase production so that you can carry on making these interest payments as well as aggressively increasing profits. You complain to the private equity company that this practice of overworking, or sweating the assets as it's known, is completely unsustainable and will only last for a few years before things start to break down. But the private equity owners don't care. They'll have hopefully sold this business for a huge profit before anything starts to break down. So they're not incentivized to care about the long-term sustainability of the business. They're only interested in squeezing everything out of the business in the short term. And there are many, many real-life examples of this happening. Probably the most notable are Debenhams in the UK and Toys R Us in the US, who went bankrupt under the strain of the massive debt burdens that were placed on them by their private equity owners, causing tens of thousands of job losses. But you might be thinking, okay, these examples are pretty bad, but surely the private equity companies will suffer as well, as they own the company. So if the company goes bankrupt, then the private equity firm will suffer as well, right? Well, amazingly, this isn't always the case. And a lot of the time, these private equity companies can actually profit off of these bankruptcies that they've caused. And to explain how they can do this, we need to take a look at the ugly side of private equity. Now, taking on a load of debt to buy a company and then burdening that company with that debt is definitely an aggressive strategy. But if the private equity owners are also exposed to the risks and pressures that they've created, then surely that's fair enough. But the problem really starts when we take a look at how private equity companies actually make their money and how they've designed a system to dodge the risks that they've created. They've done this by creating something called the 2 and 20 rule, which refers to a 2% management fee and a 20% success fee. And to explain what this is, we need to look at an example. Let's say we've started up our own private equity company. The first thing we need to do is raise a load of money from investors. And private equity companies will generally get their money from places like pension funds and high net worth individuals, or rich people. And it's at this point that we can start charging our 2% management fee. We can argue that we need to pay for offices and a team of analysts. So let's say we've raised £100 million, we can pocket £2 million each year just in a management fee. Okay, the next step is to start investing. Let's say we found a small but up and coming coffee shop chain and we purchased the whole business for £10 million. And of course, we'll use a leveraged buyout to purchase this business. So the bank will lend us, say, £8 million, meaning that we've only got to use £2 million of our investors' money. And let's imagine that this turns out to be a brilliant investment. The coffee shop chain grows rapidly with our help, and we end up selling it for £30 million a few years later, netting us a nice profit of 20 million quid. So it's at this point that we can trigger our 20% success fee. So we can take 20% of this 20 million pounds that we've just made for our investors and put it in our pockets and pay it out as bonuses to ourselves and our team of analysts. So this is an example of things going well. Think we've just made 4 million pounds and we've probably got a really small team, so everyone's really happy. But now let's take a look at what might happen if things go badly. Let's imagine the coffee shop chain went bankrupt under the weight of the debts that we placed on it. Now in this scenario, we've made no profits, and our investors have lost the £2 million which we've put in for them. But for us, the private equity company, we've actually not lost anything. We've just not been able to claim our 20% success fee. I think we can still claim our 2% management fee, which will get paid no matter what happens. So for us, the private equity company, we've actually not felt any direct pain from the bankruptcy we've just caused. But that's not all. It actually gets worse. Let's rewind back a few years to when we've just taken over the coffee shop chain. What we can do in this position is go back to the bank and ask them to lend us more money on top of the £8 million we've already borrowed. And luckily for us, because the coffee shop chain owns all of their own outlets, we can go to the bank and say, look, there's a chance we'll go bankrupt here, but if you lend us, say, another £3 million, we'll pay you a really high interest rate and you'll be able to recover most of the value of this debt if we do go under, because you'll be able to sell off all of the assets that the coffee shop chain owns. And in a lot of these situations, and especially if the company in question owns some real estate, like coffee shop outlets, the bank will agree to lend even more money. So what we, as the private equity owners, can do is just take this £3 million out of the business and put it into our own pockets in what's called a special dividend. So in this situation, the private equity company has taken home this £3 million as well as their 2% management fee, and then will not care in the slightest if the coffee shop chain goes bankrupt, as there aren't any direct financial implications on them. And this is really why a lot of people hate private equity. This example has shown how some private equity owners have managed to come out with millions of pounds worth of profits while literally causing a bankruptcy of a coffee shop chain. And there are many, many real life examples of this happening. As we mentioned earlier, Debenhams and Toys R Us are probably the most notable. But what do you think? Leave me a comment below. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. And please leave me a like if you've enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.